Good evening, and thank you for joining Insight once again. In commemoration of Black History Month, we will be discussing the legacy of Malcolm X. My name is Kokro Roberts, your host, and my guest is Dr. Saladin Ambar, a professor of political science at Rutgers University. Dr. Ambar also serves as a distinguished a distinguished scholar at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, uh, also at Rutgers University, located in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Professor Ambar, please go ahead and say a bit about yourself and talk a bit about your career.
Well, thank you. First, it's an honor to be here with you this evening to talk about Brother Malcolm and his contributions. I am Saladin Ambar. I'm a professor of political science and a senior scholar at the Institute, the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers, as you mentioned. I received my PhD at Rutgers in 2008. Prior to that, I was a high school teacher for many years, 18 years to be precise, where I taught American history, world history, AP world history, and so forth. And, grew up in Queens, New York, a borough that Malcolm X lived in for much of his time when he was with the Nation of Islam and thereafter. And spent my years, childhood, very much taken by Malcolm's speeches. Growing up in the 1980s in New York, we listened a lot to bootleg tapes of his that we found on 125th Street in Harlem at the old Mart, 125th Street Mart. Brothers and sisters would be selling those tapes. It shows you how old I am that we were listening to Malcolm on cassette tapes. But we were inspired by him and what he shared in terms of his vision for a life of empowerment for Black people throughout the diaspora. And so he was one of my inspirations growing up and wanting to receive an education that not only taught the disciplines that higher education offered, but as he so often put it, knowledge of self, knowledge of oneself was the very important factor in my going on to college and receiving a PhD ultimately.
Thank you, sir. So let's talk. Let's start with where Malcolm X was born, and a little bit about his childhood and his upbringing.
Well, Malcolm was born in Omaha, Nebraska, 1925, I believe, and grew up with two parents who were very devoted to him, but also to the teachings of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. They were Garveyites, as well as his father being a Baptist preacher. Ironically enough, given Malcolm's later movement into the world and theology of Islam, Malcolm's family ultimately became disrupted. I think that's an important and good word to use, in part because his father was ultimately killed. It was believed by a member of a white supremacist organization, and lacking funds, resources to feed Malcolm and his numerous siblings, he was forced to be separated and move on to East Lansing, Michigan. Ultimately, through East Lansing, Michigan, had to migrate eastward, where he found himself in the greater Boston area, and became a quote unquote petty criminal, someone who lived by his wits to make it in an American capitalist system in the middle of the 20th century. So that's a little bit about his early upbringing. He was very bright and arguably a gifted student, performed well in segregated schools, but received no more than a formal eighth grade education. Most of Malcolm's reading.
He went no further than eighth grade.
No.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Most of Malcolm's formal teaching he received in prison. There have been scholars, not only myself and others, Stephen Tuck at Oxford University, Jill Lepore at Harvard University, who reflected on the fact that Malcolm's first debate experience um, with university level debating was in prison in Massachusetts, where he debated members of the Oxford and Cambridge teams, respectively, during his incarceration for those crimes, or that life of crime that he had found himself in the mid 1940s.
And I understand that I mean, really was a force to contend with when it came to debating, even against, people from Ivy League universities like Oxford and Yale.
In his words, his phrase he used was, "I was gone on debating." That was the slang of his era. I was gone on debating. He relished intellectual repartee, the intellectual back and forth, and he often, as expressed in his autobiography and elsewhere, took opinions that were rather controversial, including the color of Jesus Christ. Uh, who was William Shakespeare? Was there an alternative Shakespeare that we don't really know about? But more to the point, I think there was a kind of joy in him in exchanging ideas and debating that told you a lot about who he was as a person. That Malcolm was moved by knowledge. He was a voracious reader, someone who would read anything he could get his hands on. And debating was just a forum for him to explore the life of the mind that, frankly, the American educational system robbed him and so many African Americans um, in the 19th and 20th centuries, and arguably in many respects today, as we see with movements to uh, curtail the teaching of Black history afoot in the country right now.
Is it safe to say that he was already a Black nationalist before he became a Muslim, or even before he went to prison?
I think
Based on.
so. I think so. I think the late brother Manning Marable of Columbia University, who's gracious enough to interview with me and share some of his insights into Brother Malcolm before Professor Marable passed, spoke about not only Malcolm's family as Garveyites, but also Malcolm's own intellectual development. He was far more ahead, um, you know, in terms of his reading and in terms of his intellectual insights than he let on in the autobiography. He was more astute politically than he let on, in part because he wanted to, build the narrative that everything he was and who he had become was a result of, and to be
With the
credited to the
deviation.
Nation of Islam and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But in reality, Malcolm had some real exposure to Black history and culture and knowledge of himself prior to joining the nation. Certainly, his exposure to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad in prison, certainly while incarcerated, um, fed Malcolm in a way that he had not been fed prior to being incarcerated. But he was certainly a Black nationalist. I think maybe not with all of the refinement that would occur later, but
Mhm.
he certainly had a strong sense of Black pride. I think before prison, or at least a semblance of Black pride and who he was, based on who his family was.
Well, it seemed like activists that took on this character of Black nationalism weren't looked upon kindly, by I should even by the authorities, I should say, the authorities, and by the nation as the general public, especially the white public at this time. Is that fair?
Well, certainly, I think.
I'm sorry. I'm saying that because Garvey himself was deported, and he wasn't even when it came to ideas like self defense. He wasn't even as hardcore as Malcolm X. he wanted black people to have their own society, but he didn't, talk much about fighting back, and things like that as much as Malcolm did. But he was still deported.
Well, the teachings of Garvey were pretty radical in terms of their assertions of black pride, and also his anti-colonialism was a very important theme that certainly Malcolm and others would pick up on. Africa for the Africans was a very strong message that, frankly, ran counter to Western, including American, imperial interests at the time. Today we're watching the 1 year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there's lots of support, and I think rightly so, for the Ukrainian people to stand up and claim the rights and freedoms inherent in sovereignty for their country. But these are things, as Malcolm would point out over the course of his life, that were widely accepted by Europeans, by whites, but not extended to Africans, to black people and other brown and yellow people, as Malcolm would describe the diaspora of people of non-European, non-Western descent around the world. In other words, the very rights that we see extended to the Ukrainians, and the support given for them was denied and belittled for Africans who sought a place in the sun under their own fig tree, if you will, in terms of their independence. Malcolm understood that hypocrisy for what it was, particularly at the time when the anti-colonialist decolonization movements, the movements for independence, were afoot. And so nationalism has always been something that Western society, by and large, with few exceptions, have preserved as a kind of right for Europeans, but not for Africans and others who fell under the rule of Western nations.
Well, there is something a little counterintuitive. So for example, say racism, people who practice racism in America around Malcolm's time, wouldn't you say that the interests aligned? I mean, if someone like Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey wanted blacks to self-segregate, that should be something that racists should be happy about, right? Because they don't want to integrate. So if people like Malcolm and Marcus did not want integration, they wanted self-segregation, you would think that this is something that the racist whites would agree with, would be happy with.
Well, there's some truth to that, but it becomes a little bit more complicated, particularly as Malcolm later moves outside of the guidance of Elijah Muhammad and the sort of restraints that, not sort of, but the actual restraints that were placed upon him as spokesperson for the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad later on in his career. Let's take the first part first. Malcolm and the Nation of Islam did advocate racial separation. They advocated land from America to be distributed or redistributed, a portion of which would go to African Americans. They did not believe in interracial marriage, nor did they support, the general idea of social relations between the races as a good thing. And Malcolm later, and I forget the actual date, with the Nation of Islam, this is perhaps maybe 1960 or so, had a rally with the American leader.
Professor Ambar, can you hold on one moment?
Yes, sir.
I'm having some technical issues here.
Sure.
Tell you what, I will take one break right now and fix the issue I'm having, and when we come back, we'll pick up from right where you were. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome to Matilda Healthcare Services. At Matilda Healthcare Services, the personal care of your loved ones is our mission, which we transform into a set of goals, and finally into our service offerings centered around individual clients. Our client-centered approach to personal home care ensures that your loved ones are provided individual attention, allowing them to maintain the quality of life they deserve. These services fall into three main categories: medical services, companion services, and physical therapy. Medical services include medication management, monitoring vital signs, diabetic care, colostomy care, Foley catheter care, respiratory treatment, feeding tube care, wound care, intravenous and nutrition therapy, injections, monitoring serious illness, and monitoring unstable health status. For companion services, we offer transportation to appointments and excursions, housekeeping, assistance with bathing, dressing and grooming, ambulation, meal preparation, environmental safety, medication reminders, laundry, and more. Physical therapy includes the following: evaluating patients' records and progress, assistance with speedy recovery from injury or illness, assistance with improving movement, pain management, preventive care, rehabilitation, and treatment of chronic conditions. For a free, no-hassle assessment, call 214-886-7170 or email ideyama@matildahealthcareservices.com.
Brought to you by Matilda Healthcare Services. Matilda Healthcare Services, providing quality care, one patient, one home at a time.
Welcome back to Insight. I have been speaking to Dr. Saladin Ambar of Rutgers University, a political science instructor. We are discussing Malcolm X, the legacy of Malcolm X. Professor Ambar, please go ahead and pick up where you left off before the break.
Sure. So, as I was saying, with respect to some of the similarities between Black nationalists and white separatists, there was that overlap. You know, George Norman Rockwell, who's the leader of the American Nazi Party throughout the 1950s and 60s, was invited to the Nation of Islam to a rally in 1960. I think it was 61, where Malcolm introduced him. And, you know, this was, I think, very much a dark mark on Malcolm's early career, or certainly his career within the nation and within the Nation of Islam itself. I think there's no question of that. But at the time, and in the nation's ideology of Black nationalism, there was the sense that America was hopeless with respect to race and racial integration. And this hopelessness meant that separation was the only answer or solution to the Black man's problems in America. And that's the language that was used at the time by the Nation of Islam. Malcolm would later regret this meeting. You know, I think it sort of hangs over his career, political career, as an example of what he was at least in part moving away from when he left the Nation of Islam. Racial separation is not the same as the idea that, one ought to have a sense of pride in oneself with respect to Black history and culture and so forth, aesthetics. And I think Malcolm understood this and would later, in his travel diaries and elsewhere, call into question Black nationalism as a philosophy.
So this was just early in his career. Later,
early is too strong. I think for most of his political career, he was a Black nationalist. I think the Rockwell invitation was a striking example of taking the Nation of Islam's theology and also political ideology of racial separation to its ultimate logical conclusion, where you're in agreement with members of the Nazi Party, or at least the American Nazi Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah,
think,
imagine how that sounds.
right,
It sounded.
by the same token, in 1964, 3 years later, when Malcolm is in Paris at the Salle de la Mutualité over there and on the left bank of the Seine in Paris, he's giving a talk, and afterwards in the question and answer section, he's asked, "Do you believe in interracial marriage?" And after the translation comes to Malcolm, he says, "Who can be against love?" So I think, what we see is Malcolm wrestling ultimately with the idea of Black nationalism in extremis, in the extreme. Still very much believing that Black organizations, Black communities should be supported financially by Black people, that Black political organizations should be run by African Americans. So I think, to his dying day, he certainly believed in the idea of Black empowerment, what, Stokely Carmichael would refer to as Black power. He certainly was an advocate of Black power, but I think he ultimately, particularly as a Muslim, would come to reject the idea of a kind of, linear notion of racial separation, where Blacks and whites could not engage one another fully as human beings. He says as much at Oxford in his speech there in December 3rd of 1964.
So, what specifically landed him into prison, and how long was he in prison for?
He was arrested in 1946 for, I believe, larceny, and was served 6 years of what was to be a 10-year sentence. He spent that time, as mentioned, a good deal of which through the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, reading, learning the Nation of Islam's theology, and so forth. But he was arrested for robbery, and he had been involved with a number of small time petty thieves throughout his childhood, young adulthood, and served that sentence, or a portion of that sentence, released in 1952.
Why do you think his parents, or specifically his father, chose to live in places in areas of the United States that were rife with racism and Klan activity?
Well, it's interesting. I think first of all, he was not someone who was keen on running. I think that was
He was
not.
too proud for that.
Yeah, he was very, very proud, Black man. Of I guess his father was West Indian and his mother was Grenadian. I'm not sure. I think his mother was from Grenada, or her ancestry. But anyway, he was a very proud Black man. But Malcolm would later say, as long as you are south of the Canadian border, you are in the South. If you're a Black person in the United States, meaning, in effect, where can you go? Where are you gonna go? Maine or?
No, I mean, at that point, it's just
There was
a matter of the degree to which the racism is.
I just, yeah, I mean, it's like the end of Schindler's List, where they, they tell a number of the Jews who have escaped the Holocaust. Well, don't go.
Working for Schindler.
You have no friends east. Well, don't go west. You have no friends there either. That's what it was like being a Black man in the 1950s, 60s in America. And arguably, it's not 100% altogether different today. You can find racism anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's veiled. It's more veiled and more subtle. But yeah, you can't disagree with that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, certainly. Sometimes it's more subtle. Sometimes it's not. We see a lot of these police brutality cases. They're oftentimes, excuse me for that, they're oftentimes occurring in some of the most cosmopolitan, international cities in the country. I grew up in Queens, New York, the most racially diverse county in the United States, perhaps. But I remember being told, looking for an apartment in the 90s, at least by one person, once she saw my face, we only rent to German people. I was literally told that. I remember not being able to rent an apartment because of the color of my skin in New York City, where I grew up, and no one cared about my undergraduate degree from Georgetown. And this is true today. If you're trying to buy a house in the quote unquote wrong neighborhood, meaning predominantly white neighborhood where folks sometimes don't want you, and so redlining was and is a kind of reality. In terms of home ownership and the like. So I don't want to have to go through a long laundry list reminding your listeners that, even in 2023 now, racism is alive and well. Yes, oftentimes it's more subtle, but sometimes it's not so subtle. Sometimes it's right in your face. And that's something that's part of why I think the legacy of Malcolm X is important, because Malcolm gave us some good tools to consider, some wisdom to consider in navigating the difficulties of living in a society that's still very much defined by the tenets of white supremacy.
Do you find Malcolm's teachings extreme, at some point, like some of his teachings, for example, I know that he didn't carry this out throughout his career, but the white man is the devil, things like that. Do you find that extreme?
Well, it's interesting that you would use that word, because at Oxford he participated in a debate, and the motion for the debate was extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Something Barry Goldwater had said in 1964 when he was running for president for the Republican Party. Malcolm took the view that extremism is sometimes necessary. He pointed to Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death.
Give me death, right.
So he pointed to the American revolutionary spirit and said, well, you didn't seem to mind extremism when it suited you. Extremism can't be for some and not for others. Nonviolence can only be taught to Black people during Black History Month. So he pointed out the hypocrisies, but certainly the theology of the Nation of Islam, of whites as devils, by any measure, is an extreme theology, and Malcolm ultimately would come to reject that theology. But back to the point of extremism, I think what Malcolm recognized was that oftentimes it was the idea of moderation, particularly as Dr. King talked about in his letter from a Birmingham jail, that white moderates were oftentimes behind the slow pace of civil and human rights for Black people in America and throughout the world. This let's go slow and take our time philosophy.
I mean, it wasn't happening directly to them. They weren't really feeling the pain of the racism. So
right. So Malcolm argued we were in an extreme condition and needed extreme measures. But your point is well taken. I think, part of what makes Malcolm who he is historically, who he is in the present moment, was that, yes, he was someone who came out of the, I would prefer to use the term radical tradition rather than extreme. He came from the Black radical tradition in American history. He came from the Nat Turner, David Walker, Garvey, line that said America, prophetically speaking, had, lost its way and had no right to judge right and wrong in terms of the questions of racial justice. It had reneged on its promises, and it was up for Black people to take their freedom by, as he said so often, any means necessary. That's a radical vision of liberation, and at times an extreme vision. Having said that, you could look at the career of the Nation of Islam and you could look at the career of Malcolm X. They never stormed the Capitol.
No, they did not.
They never, took down, police officers as white protesters did, or beat them upside the head with a flag on January 6th of
They
2020.
would have been massacred. They would have been massacred.
Well, absolutely. My point is that, throughout American history, when whites have felt treated unjustly, they have at times, perhaps oftentimes, found it within their right to take to the streets and to do whatever they felt was necessary to attain their freedom and dignity. And certainly this is true globally, as I alluded to with respect to the resistance in the Ukraine. I want to make the point back to nonviolence, because oftentimes Dr. King and Malcolm are put up aside one another as a kind of opposing one another intellectually and in other ways with respect to violence. But the real criterion ought not to be, or the real measure ought not to be Dr. King and Malcolm X. It ought to be the United States and African Americans with respect to the use of violence. It cannot be nonviolence as a principle. It's a beautiful principle. It's one I hold dear, and I think is ultimately where we have to be as human beings. But having said that, it cannot be a philosophy that's taught only to Black people.
Right.
Turn the other cheek cannot be a philosophy and vision of humanity that is drummed into the heads of Black people February for 28 days here. I don't see a lot of people telling Ted Cruz or Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy to go and teach Donald Trump and his followers to be nonviolent. Right. That they need to take classes to learn how to disobey civilly, to hold hands and sing. I mean, these are the kinds of things that Malcolm really hated.
Yeah, I know. I saw speeches where he actually, he did not like that.
Yeah, we got to lock arms and sing. Okay, well, what are y'all singing for your freedom? Why do we have to be the ones to sing? We pointed out the hypocrisies within, the American political system and how we frankly taught. We were taught as people of African descent, how we were taught to respond to racial injustice. Well,
in a sense, I think Malcolm and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, without meaning to, probably complemented each other. So, for example, Malcolm X Martin Luther King taught nonviolence. Turn the other cheeks and turn the other cheek and things like that. But that's not practical if you're dealing with people who don't have conscience. You know what I mean? So if you smack me on one cheek and I turn the other cheek, and you smack it and I turn the other one and you smack it, and you just keep smack. At some point it has to stop, right? So the idea of, as far as civil rights is concerned, about turning the other cheek in the face of violent extreme racism, I disagree with that. I'm lean more toward Malcolm saying things like, okay, obey the law, be respectful to everyone, but by all means, defend yourself, I am not a Muslim, I'm a Christian, but I find the idea of turning the other cheek, especially in the face of blatant violence, I find it to be honest, absurd.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but let me just say, the idea of, pacifism, resisting nonviolently, civil disobedience, Henry David Thoreau. There's a long tradition in America, the Quakers, of pacifism. Part of what Dr. King and the civil rights movement came to, in terms of the conclusion they came to, was not only was this spiritually correct in terms of Christian theology and so forth, but also it was practically, a necessity, because as you alluded to earlier, had Black people stormed the Capitol first of all, it would not have been a possibility, right? It would have been so, surrounded or ringed by, law enforcement.
You wouldn't have gotten that far.
Wouldn't even gotten to the, to the sidewalk. But let's just say hypothetically, if that were the case, that would have been a slaughter. We have evidentiary experience. We have the Black Panther Party. We have other resistance movements that engaged the United States on terms of self-defense and efforts to violently uphold one's personal rights and dignity. And the record shows that those brothers and sisters were systematically eradicated, politically eradicated, physically destroyed, killed.
People like Huey Newton, right? Is that his name? Huey Newton?
Covert apparatuses of the United States, the FBI, CIA, and others. I hate to go here, but this is the truth that, folks were taken out by the United States government. There's no polite way to say that. And we have the church hearings from the 1970s talking about how this occurred overseas. Well, you look at the history of the Black Panther Party, you look at how Dr. King was monitored and given suicide notes and threatened. And, there's a long laundry list of the fact that the United States was clearly not going to acquiesce to the, Black freedom struggle nonviolently. So to your point, it becomes ultimately a question of how one chooses to resist. I think both Dr. King and Malcolm X understood that you had to resist an unjust system, that white supremacy required resistance. For Dr. King, he believed that resistance would have to be pursued nonviolently, A, because theologically, spiritually it was correct, but also B, if not, it would lead to a bloodbath with, Black folks doing most of the bleeding. Malcolm believed, I think for much of his life, if not throughout all of his life, that resistance had to, at times, by necessity, involve violence, at least self-defense, that would be violent. And that if that meant death, as he told a Black reporter, I believe it was from the Amsterdam News, someone asked him, what's the price of freedom? He said, the price of freedom is death. Brother Malcolm was always prepared to die for his belief and for the struggle of personal and human dignity for his people and others around the world. That was a given for him. So, it comes down to a question of how does one choose to resist? Either violently or non-violently, we're up against a system. And I think Malcolm was great at deconstructing the nature of the system politically, economically, socially, aesthetically, culturally, and psychologically that denigrates who we are as a people. How one resists ultimately is a personal choice. Dr. King believed, and I think, for me personally, I aspire to it. I aspire to that as, if you're asking me, it's a vision worth aspiring to as a human being. But I understand.
And it's hard. I don't mean to make light of it. It's difficult to be attacked and not respond in kind. That's a hard thing to do. You know what I mean? Yes. It's easy to strike back, immediately when you think that, you're being attacked. But nevertheless, I would, that would be,
your point about whether or not America, white America in particular, had or has a conscience on some of these questions. Certainly Dr. King grew suspicious of that near the end of his life, in his opposition to the Vietnam War. And when he announced it in April, really a year to the day of his assassination, April 4th of 1967, when he opposed the Vietnam War, Riverside Church in Harlem came out, opposed it to it, Black and white religious organizations and liberal groups opposed him. It wasn't just conservatives who opposed him. When he came out against the war in Vietnam, Dr. King, crossed the line. But part of what he was doing was saying, okay, I'm willing to aspire to nonviolence. What are you, America, willing to do? But he didn't believe it. He didn't take that position because he believed America had a conscience. He took that position perhaps hoping America had a conscience, or enough Americans, black and white and others, would have a conscience to oppose the war.
It did help him, though. It did help him when people started to see images of protesters, nonviolent protesters being attacked. So definitely, it was a good strategy in terms of furthering the aims of his movement. That's for sure. So if he had responded violently, the rage, his aims wouldn't have been accomplished as quickly as it was. I don't think.
No, I think I think it was King studied Gandhi, he studied Thoreau, he studied the pacifist movement globally. But I think he also understood in the American context, where Black people represented a distinct minority, it would lead, anything other than a nonviolent approach would lead to, slaughter.
Okay. So it wasn't strictly a religious choice.
I think for him personally, yes, it was. But I think also strategically, even if he had aspired to something different, I think he understood that it would be ultimately an irresponsible thing to say, "Hey, y'all, let's go for broke here and pull off a January 6th type thing." Brother,
That's right. So let's take another break, and when we come back, we will continue our discussion. Okay. Right. Okay. One moment.
Welcome to Roberts E-Commerce Solutions. To promote your business or upcoming event on social media platforms, Roberts E-Commerce Solutions can help. Ensure your peace of mind by calling Roberts E-Commerce Solutions. From the intricacies of unleashing social media campaigns to scaling up visibility for your business by leveraging the use of Facebook-owned parallel platforms, Instagram, and WhatsApp, Roberts E-Commerce Solutions promises expertise. We can create and deploy promotional videos, flyers, and other digital assets concurrently, creating a multi-pronged approach that delivers visibility. For video promotions, we can use compelling motion graphics templates such as titles, intros, outros, transitions, logo reveals, and other elements to bring the essence of your ideas to life. Besides creating digital assets, we also understand how to navigate across the various business components contained within Facebook's Meta Business Suite, an appliance that centralizes and links Facebook to Instagram and WhatsApp, as well as the resulting analytics that can all be viewed on a single dashboard. Meta Business Suite allows small businesses the ability to effectively launch targeted ads based not only on geography, but also on demographics and the interests of potential customers. To schedule a free consultation, call 6827-850-847 or email info@consult-res.net. Roberts E-Commerce Solutions, empowering small businesses and nonprofits.
Welcome back to Insight. If you're just joining us, today we are discussing the legacy of Malcolm X. My guest is Professor Saladin Ambar of Rutgers University. He is a political science professor there. Professor Ambar, let's continue with our discussion. So, do you think at some point when Malcolm became involved with the Nation of Islam, do you think that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad might have felt a little jealous of his popularity, especially when he started going around and giving speeches, and he was starting to be in demand, and started to gain more popularity than Elijah Muhammad himself.
So I think that is, I think that's a fair assessment. But it wasn't just ordinary, human jealousy or envy, or looking at this younger man who's successful rhetorically in ways that Elijah Muhammad was not. Not a rhetorician, not a great public speaker. Yet, Elijah Muhammad, raised up Malcolm, Muhammad Ali, Louis Farrakhan, who, despite, many flaws and things we could discuss about him that have been wrong over the years, certainly a distinctive figure in American political history. So whether it's Farrakhan, Malcolm X, or Muhammad Ali, they come through the line of Elijah Muhammad, who was a significant figure. But I think you're right. I think there was jealousy there. But it was not, again, as I say, it's not just a sort of your, pedestrian jealousy. I think it was also cultivated, enabled, and exacerbated by informants within the FBI, who clearly, and we have many records of this, sought to create division between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. I think that was a strategy. So yes, I think there were some natural jealousies there. I think, but a wedge was sown or created or enabled to deepen between the two men. And that was not accidental. Much of that was intentional. And we have good records from the FBI through the Freedom of Information Act to learn how many informants were involved in sowing seeds of division, not only within the Nation of Islam, but within SNCC and the SCLC and lots of Black freedom organizations and other organizations, the anti-war movement, the women's movement. Lots of divisions were sown by our own government in the interests of, quote unquote, American national security interests, and so forth. So yes, but ultimately, we as a people have to, and I'm speaking as a African American male now, we as a people have to come to grips with the fact that Malcolm was ultimately killed by Black hands, whether they were in part inspired by forces outside of the Black community, whether or not they were enabled through machinations beyond the means of African Americans, whether Malcolm was poisoned in Cairo, as some have argued, or not permitted to stay in France because France did not want him assassinated on French soil. There are lots of stories about Malcolm and American intelligence agencies and the like, but we have to get through a very primal fact, which is, as Chuck D said, it was a brother who pulled the trigger, when he was talking about Huey Newton, the shooting of Huey Newton.
Right.
If I can go back to Public Enemy, these are Black hands that did this deed. And that says something about the need for self-love. It says something about the need for a different kind of internalization of resistance that was not accessible at that time, and we still have, despite all of the aforementioned levels of white supremacy and racism that restrict Black people in this country from reaching our full capacity. We still are engaging in acts of self-harm that have to be addressed, irrespective of, or at least in conjunction with, the larger superstructure of capitalism, white supremacy, and so forth. So, I don't want to take the spotlight entirely away from the fact that, um, there were some internal problems there that existed and still persist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And even Malcolm X's brother Filbert was used in a way by the Nation of Islam, to be sure, not by whites, to speak against Malcolm, even after his death. I found that very sad. Um, so his mother was placed in a psychiatric home after his father died. And for years after he became a successful, powerful figure, his mother remained in that facility. Why do you think it took him so long to orchestrate her removal from that facility? Even though it's something that he admits bothered him for years.
It's a good question. And, I don't know enough about the inner workings of Malcolm's family to really offer enlightened comment on his mother's institutionalization. And beyond what Malcolm says in the autobiography and elsewhere about his inability to assist her, I know it was a something that haunted him. Her demise was something that haunted him. But I can't speak to what could have been or might have been, or what Malcolm thought he should have done, if anything, to have her released. Again, part of what we're dealing with, I think Malcolm talks about this very clearly and forcefully in the autobiography, is we're dealing with a system, and I think he uses this language. No system has ever, done greater destruction to a family than the American system has done to mine. And the institutionalization of his mother was sort of like a final blow, along with his incarceration, obviously. And I think that too was part of his political analysis of the United States, that there was a system here where if you were a bright young African-American kid who wanted to be a lawyer, as Malcolm did, you know what? We got other plans for you, is essentially what America told Malcolm. And we got plans for your family. We got plans for your father. We got and this kind of institutional racism is the language we use today, something Malcolm understood viscerally. But I can't really speak to some of the specifics that, unfortunately, that your question requires.
When President Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm X made a comment in the press, by the way, that what something to the effect, what else can you expect? This is the chickens coming home to roost. The Nation of Islam quickly distanced themselves from that comment and that mentality. Do you think it hurt Malcolm X, those comments hurt him? And if so, how bad do you think it hurt him?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, one of the things to understand is, the Nation of Islam was radical in terms of its reorientation of how Black people saw themselves in this country. But it was it was a very conservative political organization. Malcolm was not allowed to go to the March on Washington. That was something that the Nation of Islam did not want its leading spokesperson to go and do, nor its members. It was an apolitical organization, for lack of a better term, at least in the formal sense of what politics constituted then and now. Yet Malcolm went to the March on Washington. Malcolm wanted to speak out more forcefully. In 1962, when Ronald Stokes was murdered in Los Angeles, he went out there and wanted more political action, more forceful, retaliatory action if possible. The Nation of Islam was not going to allow Malcolm to do that. They were politically conservative and wanting to kind of keep the peace between themselves and the United States government as much as possible, and to economically address the ills of the Black community, as well as to do so theologically, religiously, through the building of mosques and reorienting Black people towards themselves. Malcolm, by the time 1963 rolled around, had already become a very political person, seeking, a kind of more traditional resistance than the one the Nation of Islam offered. So when the question and answer session began, Malcolm had gotten through his speech that day about
So he
whatever.
had already been instructed not to speak.
And he followed suit. He delivered his remarks without any comment about Kennedy's assassination until the question and answer session, and he couldn't help himself.
Well, excuse me, Dr. Ambar, but I'm told that he usually didn't ask for answering questions, period, after he spoke. But on this particular occasion, he did, almost as if he was welcoming a question like that, looking for an opportunity to say what he said.
Yeah, it's I can't get inside the head of Malcolm, but it's quite possible. Look, I think the point is that by late 1963, he and Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam had already begun to grow apart. And Malcolm's desire to become more engaged politically was very present and preeminent in his thinking. And so if it hadn't been that conversation or that quote about Kennedy,
it would have come up
it
somewhere.
would have been something else. Something else would have happened. Somebody else would have, Malcolm was becoming uneasy, I think it's fair to say. And, Manny Marable's book and other texts speak to this, with sort of the trajectory of the Nation of Islam as a, religious organization that was in very much limited politically. There's no question that he disobeyed Elijah Muhammad. He crossed the line. He was suspended for it.
Yeah, I think that was when he spent some time with Muhammad Ali out in.
Yeah, and there's lots of good pop culture movies and documentaries and miniseries about that now. And it's when he was on the outside that made Muhammad Ali have to choose, right? Ultimately, he decided to remain within the Nation of Islam at that time.
So you wrote a book about Malcolm's visit to the Oxford Union, the book titled Malcolm X at Oxford Union, Race Politics in the Global Era. Can you talk a little about that book?
Well, when I was teaching my undergraduate class at the time, a course in Black political thought, and I wanted to find a speech for them, maybe that one that they were not as familiar with, from Malcolm. Message to the Grassroots is a classic. The Ballad of the Bullet is a classic. But I came across the Oxford Address and I read it. I had read it before, but I read it this time and it struck me how marvelous it was, how powerful it was, and how uniquely international it was. And that led me to do some research into what was going on in England at the time, the UK, but also what was going on in the United States in 1964. And there was this movement against civil rights, both in the United States and in the UK. And Malcolm steps into Oxford and delivers a very powerful address, 30 minutes long, about why Black folk ought to have every right to attain their freedom by any means necessary in the United States, but around the world. But he also enlists the help of white supporters at the end of the speech. I don't care what color you are, so long as you want to change the miserable condition that exists on this earth.
Sounds like he was still evolving. I mean,
I think so. It's pretty clear. And, Malcolm, people often ask, well, what if Dr. King would have lived? What if Malcolm would have lived? What if Robert Kennedy would have lived? Well, yeah, I think that's precisely the point. I think, if this were any other country, we would look at these events and we'd say, oh my God, the people of Chile, there's just been a right-wing assault on the progressive forces of Chile or Guatemala or, formerly Indochina or some other country. But because it's the United States, we kind of look at these events as one-offs rather than systematically looking at some of us do, obviously, maybe not enough of us, look at what took the assassinations of the 1960s and 70s as a period of serious repression, violent repression against progressive forces seeking to attain rights and justice for racial and other minorities in the United States and around the world. That's what happened. Malcolm was evolving, but not allowed to continue to evolve, just as Brother Martin was moving away from simply thinking about America and its racial problem domestically. He was thinking about America's military power and its force around the world. He was thinking about militarism. He was thinking about the fact that we, are so violent in Vietnam, but not willing to, grant that right to young Black people in the ghetto. Martin said, "Look, I'm going to stop telling people in the hood to be violent, nonviolent, until I talk to my own country first about what he said. The greatest purveyor of violence around the world is my own country." Well, that's radical language. That's prophetic language, and in that sense, Malcolm and Martin kind of had a meeting of the heart and mind in that period where King becomes more radical and Malcolm becomes not less radical, but more inclusive in who can participate in the Black freedom struggle and the struggle for racial and other forms of justice around the world. And so the Oxford moment speaks to that. And I encourage people to read the speech. And you can listen to the entire, you don't just have to buy my book. I'd love it if you buy my book, but you can listen to the entirety of the speech online. And you can YouTube or whatever platform you use, you can see visually Malcolm for at least half the speech. What you may not be able to understand is the context. And that's what I was hoping to get in that book, the context politically, both in the United States and in Europe, really, because Malcolm, a week before Oxford, speaks in Paris, the aforementioned speech I told you about earlier. He's looking to expand the horizons of the Black freedom struggle to the Black diaspora, wherever they may be, including in Europe.
So your book doesn't only talk about the events in Oxford?
No, sir.
Okay.
Malcolm had, I was told by Carlos Moore, his translator and bodyguard, Afro-Brazilian revolutionary brother, Cuban brother. I was told by Carlos Moore that Malcolm was looking to expand the Organization of Afro-American Unity not only into London, not only into Paris, but into Amsterdam.
And he was basing this on the Organization of African Unity.
Correct. Yes.
From the 60s.
Absolutely, which he greatly admired.
Right. Do you have any theory of your own on who was ultimately responsible for Malcolm's assassination?
Well, I think there's been a Netflix documentary about that. There's been a number of people who've clearly, a number of sources over the years that have clearly shown that at least two of the brothers who had been incarcerated for so long were not involved in the killing. But I want to come to James Baldwin's debate with, I guess it was.
Which one? I am not your Negro or something.
I think this is when he, no, it wasn't had nothing to do with the Buckley debate. Actually, this is in the aftermath of Malcolm's killing. James Baldwin said, in so many words, the white political system killed Malcolm. I think that's right. We as a people were involved. Black folk pulled the trigger. There's no question. And that's something we cannot, sweep under the rug easily. That's, that's a painful confrontation that we have to continually engage.
Well, I made a point of saying who's ultimately responsible. I think who would have given such a.
I'm placing the responsibility ultimately on Malcolm's assassination, on the white supremacist system that incarcerated him in the first place, that rejected who he was and his humanity in the first place. I'm not taking Uncle Sam off the hook because we clearly saw that Malcolm had been targeted by federal and international forces, covert forces in this country, that his demise was something worked for. And so I think, here's the real question. Absent a system of white supremacy, would Malcolm X had lived? I think the answer is yes.
I think that's
so, I don't want to absolve any person from, the justice that they should receive in a very tangible way from a legal system that, that put other people in prison who did not participate in that assassination. I don't want to say that whoever pulled the trigger, is not guilty. I'm saying yes, and in addition, and more forthrightly, more importantly, this was an assassination that was not just a singular, in the sense that at least as I see Malcolm's assassination, I see it as part of a continuum.
Well, it wasn't even the first attempt, actually. There have been several attempts before the successful one.
Well, yes, but also, Malcolm is one of many people who were killed during this period. His was early, but there are many others, including Dr. King's. And I will, far be it from me, to raise this, but, the Kennedy brothers assassinations these were not, William McKinley in Buffalo getting shot by, a lone assassin, in the same way that, the assassination attempt on Reagan was clearly someone who was mentally disturbed. These are political assassinations in the truest and broadest sense of the word. We may never know all of the details, and those details would be great to know, but they're not as important as our own understanding that we need to confront the darker forces of this country's history and look them squarely in the eye. If we are to be a better nation, I think we can be a better nation. I think we can be a better people. And by people, I'm meaning as human beings who aspire to a democratic system in which the rights and privileges of being a human being are extended to all without favor. I think that's the goal. I think ultimately that's the goal Malcolm died for. When he was in his last days talking about a world revolution. It was going to involve everyone. And so I don't view Malcolm's assassination as, who killed Malcolm? Yes, is an important question. But what were the forces involved that, enabled the assassination of so many dynamic political leaders who were seeking change, seeking to end the war in Vietnam, to extend the rights of women, to extend the rights of people abroad to be who they were in the fullest sense. Lumumba, I don't have to go to
Lumumba, right? Yeah, that was orchestrated.
Many people who were taken out, who deserved an opportunity to play out organically a different set of possibilities for themselves and their country. That's the truth, as I see it. And I'm happy you raised the question because, when we think of Malcolm in isolation, I think we lose sight of, the darker forces that were present. And
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
In this country and globally.
So, Dr. Ambar, what kind of work are you involved in at the Eagleton Institute? Is it Eagleton or Ingleton?
Eagleton.
The
Yes.
Eagleton Institute of Politics.
So we focus on, American politics. I write about American politics and elections. I do that quite a bit. I also spend some time writing about American governors and the governorship and highlighting the role of governors in America's political system. It's very important. I think we see how important governors are increasingly in our political system. But I also write a lot about race and politics. And currently I'm writing a book on Abraham Lincoln and how he delivered his first ever speech of consequence in 1838 that was inspired by the killing of a Black man named Francis McIntosh, a brother who was removed from his prison, his jail in St. Louis, and burned alive by a white mob. Lincoln speaks about this murder, along with a number of other murders, and writes about how speaks about how the United States has to regain its democratic footing or die by suicide. So I'm very much interested in that speech. I'm very much interested in who Francis McIntosh was and the other people who Lincoln mentions in the speech who were killed, including whites and blacks in Mississippi. The abolitionist leader, Elijah Lovejoy, his murder is referenced by Lincoln. And in fact, this weekend, I'm traveling to St. Louis, hopefully to meet with some members of the St. Louis community interested in reparative justice, to learn from them what Francis McIntosh and his legacy means to folks there, anyone of any color who cares about racial justice and a better country. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any final thoughts before we end the broadcast?
No, I guess I want to highlight one of the important things that perhaps the most important thing that Malcolm, at least to me, to my eyes, represented for Black folks in particular, which is that self-love is so important. You know, you wake up every morning in a society that may seek to reject who you are based on the color of your skin, the width of your nose, the fullness of your lips. We wake up every
Thanks
day
for having here.
we wake up every day in a society that whose value system seems to suggest that you're less of a full human being. Now, people may say, "Well, I don't understand that. I just saw Rihanna in the Super Bowl. I don't believe that's true anymore." I got news for you. I got a set of children, Black children. They're triplets. They're almost 16 years old. And I wish I could tell you that white supremacy has played no role in their mental, intellectual formation. It's something that they have to resist consciously day in and day out. Malcolm wanted, as much as anything, for there to be self-love among Black folks in this country and everywhere else. To learn your history, to be a voracious reader, to don't let anyone else tell you about your history. Learn that yourself. And when you do, then you can see your full humanity. You know, until you know and believe that you're just as good, just as beautiful, just as important, marvelous as anyone else, it's hard to be an equal human being if you are self-loathing or unsure of who you are. Malcolm represented Black dignity. And I think that's a gift that he gave us because he certainly had it. And with an 8th grade education, was able to travel the world and meet with world leaders and stand boldly in a time of great peril and inspire so many of us to be better in a system where that's not always easy, to put it mildly. And so love yourself, seek out knowledge, work hard, because Malcolm did. And that's a lesson that we can never see grow old. He represents the best in us in that way.
Thank you very much. He was truly a remarkable individual. And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Ambar, for agreeing to an interview on Insight. I really appreciate you coming out, considering how busy you are. So please continue your work. Your work is very important. I thank you for everything you do to promote this kind of discourse and this kind of education, this kind of knowledge. And I hope the best for you in all of your future endeavors.
Thank you. And I appreciate your work, and you're doing really important work yourself. So I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you and encourage you. And if there's anything I can ever do to help out, you let me know. Okay, brother?
Thank you very much. Okay.
Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.